like
Yeah.
it just starts. Like, hey, we're
That's
live right now. What do
that's
you
perfect.
know? Yeah,
That's
right.
one of the things that's endearing about his show, though. You always wonder what were they talking about before the show came on.
Right, that's part of the intrigue because like you feel like you're like getting immersed into a conversation rather than like being part of a show, right? Like you show up and your friends are at like the bar at the restaurant table and you just show up and just slide right in, right?
Yeah, and I would love to know how many of my listeners just fast forward through the first minute and a half of my show where I do all the introductions and stuff. I'm sure it's a lot of people. I mean, I know like when I listen to Part of the Problem or other shows like that where all the advertisements are up front, I turn it on and just hit like 30 seconds 3 or 4 times, and then you're right to where you want to be.
Yeah, it's so I'm it depends on the show for me. Like there's some shows that I actually like the intros to. But yeah, for the most part, I think I probably do skip past like as much as it depends what you're listening to also. But I'm just gonna tweet out quick that we're live. Thank you
Perfect.
everybody for tuning in. This is for those who don't know, this is I guess the third of my impromptu mini series. The kind of it was tail end of last year, kicking this year off. I was always kind of bugged that I ended Daniel 3 podcast on like a weird, like not even number. So I was just like, and this is also partly an experiment, which I'll get to in a bit. But I was like, I'm just going to like, well, I guess I'll explain it in this answer. I was like, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone because I want to see if there's a market for like the green room to be more than just an interview show. Like I think it can be like just a place where we have more kind of casual, laid back conversations like this. Everyone has different tastes, but sometimes I like listening to stuff that's not too heavy-handed, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
maybe they talk a little about politics and stuff, but sometimes I just like listening to interesting people just kind of have a conversation and dialogue, and it's like listening to music, but different, right? Just something
Yeah.
to kind of like, while you're doing something else, have something in the background, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you on that. And it's nice to go in and out of those shows sometimes. It's not too serious. You don't have to really put your mind to it. It's just nice to listen to a couple people have an interesting conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And you were actually, so I was excited to get you back on. I'm going to actually republish this just on the regular Green Room feed too. But you were my last regular
Yes.
guest on the Daniel 3 podcast. You were episode 92, and then 93 was just like me saying, so long, folks.
Right. Well, that was a great honor. Was that the one where we were talking about inspiration and inerrancy? I think was
yes.
that episode.
Yes.
That was a fun time. That was the first time that we ever actually talked.
That's before you joined because that was before you joined LCI, I think.
Yeah,
you
I think
just
so.
kind of like you had just started talking to Doug, and then it was funny because Doug started talking to you, and I had scheduled you on. He was like, "Oh, you're having Alex on," and then he was like, "I'm thinking about inviting him on." So then it all worked out. Now, you've been. How long ago was that? I guess that was
23, right? Almost 2 years.
Yeah, it's almost 2 years.
Yeah,
crazy.
Man, I know it is really hard to believe that we've been doing this for that long because you joined LCI not long before I did, right?
Yeah, it was like November of 22, so not that much of a gap now.
Yeah, man, it's hard to believe that we've been doing this for that long.
No, it's. I mean, and I've been. For me, it's weird because like I look at my episode numbers, and it's like I've actually done a lot of podcasts. I just I haven't actually broken 100 with any of my podcasts yet, right? So technically, I've done almost. So if you count Green Room, Daniel 3, and Biblical Anarchy, I've probably done 270 shows or so. I think there's 40 Green Rooms, 90 something. So it's like, yeah, so 90, gosh, I can't do math right now. 95, 96, Daniel 3. We're up to 85 on Biblical Anarchy, so that's like, what, 180. And then another 40. So like 220, 230 total. But it's spread out over 3 shows, whereas you've just stayed put and, been able to... What episode number are you up to now?
I think I'm on like 175 or 176, somewhere in that ballpark.
Man, you only... How long were you podcasting, I forget, before you joined LCI?
I started it was about 9 months. I started I guess my first episode came out maybe early May of 2022. So yeah, it had been about 9 months, I guess, before I joined LCI, 9 or 10 months.
Now you were cranking out the content. Have you always done weekly?
Yeah, I mean, when I
Okay.
started that, like that was when I started the podcast. I knew I wanted to be on a regular schedule. I knew I wanted to do it once a week, and I picked Tuesdays just kind of because all of the podcasts I was listening to at the time were not released on Tuesday, and I was like, well, I can slot mine in there, and it wound up working out pretty well with LCI schedule, so that was very fortuitous. And then two, it's been nice. Like, I try to keep my Tuesday episodes like the really substantial, more serious ones, but for my extra content, if I have more of a fun conversation with someone, or like I did a bunch of preaching in my church back in the fall, and I took the recordings of that, I'll release those on Thursdays. And it really does, when you're doing 2 a week, like it'll add up pretty quick.
Oh yeah, I bet. See, I didn't have a regular schedule with the Daniel 3 podcast. It was always like there'd be, a week or two without an episode, and then there'd be like a week where there'd be 3 episodes at
Yeah.
once. I didn't actually start more, like regular, because the Daniel 3 podcast was such a like just sort of a grab bag of like anything, and it was sort of like me. It wasn't more till the end. I think at the end I started feeling more comfortable putting more. Like the first half of that show, I was actually just like putting ideas together. So I didn't just feel like it was kind of a little more
Right.
like I'd have someone and be like, help me understand this, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until towards the end of that when I joined LCI, kind of like perfectly aligned, where I felt like, okay, I get this now, that I can like kind of talk about it on my own, or, interview people without like, uh, having to have like a specific agenda. Like I don't understand. Well, sometimes you want to have people on, but I at least understand what I believe, right?
Right.
Like there's a difference when you're doing a show and you don't know what you believe and you're like, sort of interviewing people to figure that out. And then there's like, you have your own worldview, but you do want to still learn from other people to kind of understand where they're coming from. Which your show, by the way, is really cool. Like you've really branched out. Like you're just, doing almost like a straight theology podcast at some points
Yeah.
now, which is
Yeah. No, it's
pretty cool to
definitely been the
listen
trend
to.
in the last couple of months for sure. But man, again, like my background's in biblical studies, I just love it. And that was one of the most unfortunate aspects of leaving the ministry, is that I just didn't really have an opportunity to explore those ideas anymore. And so it's been really incredible getting back into that and then getting to meet a lot of really cool biblical scholars. And I love having this relationship with these publishers, especially like Ehrman's and IVP, where they just send me these books for free and then guarantee that I have an interview with the author. It's pretty wild. Like, because there are a lot of people, especially over the last year, that like, I mean, 10, 15 years ago, I was reading their work and I really looked up to these guys and they had such a huge impact on my worldview. And now I just get to like talk to them and meet them in person. It's pretty awesome. I love doing that.
That was like the first time I interviewed Carrie. And like I had her on, I think I had her on like episode 4 or
Yeah, it was
5 of Daniel 3. And like I remember like, cause like, and like before that I like watched her in her debate with Walter Block, and so I'm just like, I was like, oh, I have Carrie Baldwin on my show. Like that's so wild.
yeah.
And so it's funny when you have interviews with people like that, who you remember reading their stuff or like watching their stuff, and now you're like, oh, I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
There was like, we both have interviewed Stephen Wolf a couple times over the last year. Like that was super weird, right?
Yeah.
Like we went from like 2 years ago, like just like writing, things about him and talking about it on our show, and then all of a sudden he's like coming on our shows and like actually like really friendly towards us, which was
Yeah.
like that's not exact. I wouldn't. That wasn't on my 2024 bingo card.
Right. Yeah, but man, I mean, he is like he said to us, he's a paleoconservative at heart, so he's not that far away from our libertarian position. And I know that we've been sharing some of the drama between all the Christian nationalists in our LCI group thread, but he clearly stands out from the rest of the pack. Like there's kind of like the morass of mainstream Christian nationalism, and Stephen Wolf is just so much smarter and so much better than all of those guys.
See, that's how I feel. Like and it's not even that. Like I can still see things that he says that like it's not just like I have a disagreement of opinion. I go, no, I think he actually has a few things very, critically wrong. But yeah, there's just more thought going. He's not just a like, I think some people just think Christian nationalism is just sort of like rebranded theonomy.
Yeah.
And Stephen just doesn't fit any of those stereotypes. He's not a theonomist. He's not even a post-mill guy. He actually takes like, he is so polar opposite of a theonomist that he even goes further. Like he's like, not only should we not use the Mosaic law for how to govern. We shouldn't look to the Bible to how to govern at all, almost, is sort of like his argument. Like we should just use, or I guess like, I think he admitted like maybe there's like a little bit, but for the most part, he derives a lot of his principles from just like, well, we just learn what government is and nationalism is from nature, and then the Christianity informs that, is sort of his base. I'm on the fly summarizing his argument.
Yeah, you're right.
But that's like, it's just, but like, and you can listen, I don't even agree with him there, but I can just respect like, hey, that's different, right? And I can tell like he's actually trying to think about things rather than just like, putting a fresh paint of coat on, obstructionism.
Right. Well, and it's just like, and this is where I think with Christian nationalism, a lot of people get it wrong. It's a very diverse group of people, and there really is no such thing as Christian nationalism. There are kind of various expressions of this general idea. And in a lot of ways, it's like any denomination in the United States today. I grew up in the Lutheran Church, and for a long period of time, we were associated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is a fairly progressive wing of the Lutheran Church. And then we voted to leave and we went to the LCMC, which was a fairly conservative wing of the Lutheran Church. And so it's almost like if someone asks you, like, are you a Lutheran? And you say yes, you have to ask the follow-up question, well, what kind of Lutheran are you? Because ELCA Lutherans are way different than LCMC Lutherans. And I think it's the same thing with Christian nationalists. Like, even though they all bear the label, there is a lot of daylight between someone like Doug Wilson and someone like Stephen Wolfe. And I think the more that we've been in dialogue with Stephen Wolfe, the more apparent that that's become. And one of the things that I also really respected about him after meeting with him and then interviewing him one-on-one was that, I mean, he is kind of a troll. Like, he's actually a really funny guy. And I know that he said a lot of things in his book that he knew were going to piss people off. And he said it just to piss them off. He's in a lot of, he's kind of like the LP New Hampshire of the Christian nationalists. Like, he says things because he knows it's going to make people angry. And, in some ways I can kind of respect that.
Yeah, there's like, and I know even some, within our camp at LCI don't entirely agree with us. Like, I don't, and I guess, I don't know, listen, these things are kind of, sorry, there's sirens going off by my house, if you guys hear that.
Hopefully that's not that cop coming to arrest you from earlier.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah, guys, before if I smell like bacon, it's because I had a run-in with a cop before I got on the show, which is, I don't know, dude, before I went down to, total tangent, before I went down to Rescue the Republic with Doug and Matthew, I got pulled over by a cop.
Pennsylvania
anytime
cops.
I do LCI stuff lately, where I'm like, where two or more LCI people gather, suddenly the cops show up to. Oh man,
I wish it could have been in Vegas. Think about the time we could have had. It'd have been like The Hangover. That'd have been awesome.
Oh gosh.
But anyway, so Stephen Wolfe. Yeah, so Stephen Wolfe.
Yeah, Stephen Wolfe. Oh well, so I know, like, listen, I guess like racism is something that's sort of a spectrum. So like, listen, I don't know, like maybe Stephen has some views that like in the spectrum of like 0% racist and 100% racist, maybe it's more than 0%. But like overall, I don't know. I just don't get the sense from talking to him. Like, reading his book was one thing. Reading his book, there were a few things where I was like, I don't know about that. But then like you talk to him about it and he clarifies himself on Twitter in conversations, and you go, listen, it's like, I think the problem is more that nationalism and sort of like trying to make a justification for the sort of nationalism he's justifying, it does invoke a sort of collectivist rhetoric, which then, like, if you're saying that we need to have immigration controls and like protect a sort of like white European heritage, like I can get how like that sounds racist. And again, who knows if it's, I'm not qualified to be here and say like it's, it's this much racist, right? But I don't get the sense that like he is lying awake at night, like afraid or like hating, like, man, I just hate minority. You know what I mean? Like, he's not like this like cartoonishly racist figure from interacting with him that like some people want to make it out. Like they want to make the case for Christian nationalism out like it's essentially the case for white nationalism. And I'm like, it's not that at all. Like, that's not really his focus.
Yeah, although I'm sure that there are, not I'm sure, I know that there are some people in that camp that are out and out racist. But then a part of me too is like with some of the editorial decisions that were made in the case for Christian nationalism, I would have loved to have seen behind the scenes how much of an impact like Doug Wilson and his team had on the final form of the case for Christian nationalism. If some of the more incendiary rhetoric didn't come from them, or if he was just a straight troll. But I mean, to your point, Jacob, I really do feel like this is the way that he talks about communities and preserving community identities is not that much different than what Hans Hermann Hoppe does in his work. And, Hoppe is just very unapologetic that, and I think that historically speaking, it's true that the Western world has given us as a species some ideas that have materially made the world a better place. And we shouldn't be apologetic about that. And from a libertarian perspective, if people want to live in communities with people that look like them and think like them, then they have a right to do so. And with Stephen Wolfe, like his whole argument is just like, okay, and he does make this pretty clear in the case for Christian nationalism. People tend to think like certain people and they want to associate with people that think and live like them, and it's not even necessarily based on race. Like it could be based on class, it could be based on whatever interest it might be. People just have a preference to be in relationships with those that are similar to them, and we shouldn't try to necessarily fight against that natural inclination, or we shouldn't necessarily say that that natural inclination is bad or wrong. And I think that he makes a very fair point about that there. But anyone that has any sort of like woke identitarian background would immediately look at rhetoric like that and say, well, you're a huge racist, when in reality, there's a lot more nuance to the argument that he's trying to make.
Yeah, I mean, even libertarians don't all agree on, like, you brought up Hoppe. I mean, another good example is like Jeff Deist. Do you remember his infamous, there are some people who still care about blood and soil comment,
Yes.
which, Deist had that little bit of a troll personality to him too, a little bit, which is like, again, it's like, I don't even know if I entirely agree with Deist on that, but like, I think the point that you have to at least give to like Wolf, to Deist, to Hoppe is that, like, I actually do think that what America represents in the ideal in terms of like a sort of diversity, hopefully of more than just skin color, but a true sort of melting pot thing. Like I actually think that is good,
Yeah.
On balance. But we do also have to recognize that A, it won't be for everyone, and B, that is somewhat unique in the history of the world. And it's also like, even like in Western civilization, sort of like post-Enlightenment, like Europe wasn't exactly like this sort of like a cosmopolitan, sort of like, place in the 1700s and 1800s, and even like especially in the early parts of the 1900s, they still had a lot of like, sort of like they identified more and more with like their kinsmen, right? I mean, my wife really likes that it's like a book series that turned into a show called Outlander, and it kind of goes through the like Scottish clans and their resistance to like British rule and the Jacobite rebellion and all that. And like you look at there's a lot of that struggle in history, and like and if you were gonna go back to that time period and tell people that like, hey, there's like a whole continent you haven't even heard of yet, and like once people get there, there's gonna be 330 million people that have all come from different parts of the world,
Right.
and they're gonna like kind of get along and be under one national identity, but still have their kind of subcultures. It'd be like, what? Like that? What? It's a little unique, right? Like, so you have to at least, I think, and there have been some drawbacks to it. So I think there's just people that are like, I don't know if I like this, which to Hoppe's credit, like he's, to the libertarian idea credit, like freedom of association is also freedom of disassociation, and you have the right to self-determination. So some people want to live in very pluralistic, diverse areas, and some people don't.
Yeah. And I think that that's natural and that's okay. And I also really do believe that one of the problems with, and you can see this, you made a great point about Europe. You can see this in Europe right now. I think that the reason why there has been a rise in more right-wing governments in Europe is that there have been a lot of people that have been apologists for the UN that come from all these European countries that want to dissolve the identity of these independent nations throughout Europe. So the original idea of the European Union was that we're going to have this trading block, and we're going to make it easier for people to travel and trade. And then there are progressives that have taken that even further and said, well, we're going to dissolve these national national identities. And it turns out that people don't want to have those national identities dissolved. And the way I look at it, like from the standpoint of the United States, you go back to the 1990s, and race relations really wasn't that much of a problem in the 1990s, not like it was today. And I think a lot of it is the fact that we live in a society where we're kind of forced to, against our liberty and against our property, we're kind of forced to accept all of these ideas. And we're told that if we don't subscribe to whatever the prevailing, racial and cultural theories of the, political elite tell us that we have to believe, then we're bad people and we're racist. And I think the pushback you get is actual real racism. Like, people respond to that in a negative way. Whereas if we just had like kind of free trade and toleration, and everyone's just like, you know what, we can be different, but we're going to respect each other's right to live how we see fit, and we're going to trade with each other, and we're going to try to cooperate to the best of our abilities, then you avoid a lot of that conflict from the start. So I actually think that it's the progressives who are creating a lot of these, the reification, I guess would be the Marxist term, but they're actually creating a lot of these problems that they think that they're fighting against, ironically.
Yeah, there's something about like, so I've been having this discussion with a lot of people lately, including our Cody, another one here at LCI, who kind of approaches this a little differently, I think, than perhaps you or I do. But I wonder, like, I think part of the problem is that the immigration crisis in Europe and then in America it's escalated so much that, like, and I always have to tell people, listen, like, because you have to caveat everything, right?
Right.
I'm still like, I would still like, I don't like the false dichotomy, but if given the choice, I'm still more on the side of open borders than closed borders. Just because it's sort of like, I think the trade-offs are typically going to be worse for trying to close the border than keeping some, maybe not totally open, but more open. But like, I don't know, like, can we at least admit that, like, what's going on in Europe and what's going on with our immigration problem, like, it's not a free market outcome. It's the result of all sorts of state intervention. And
Yes.
we can't necessarily fault people for, like, responding to all of these changes and having a negative reaction to it. Now, should we feed into those negative reactions? Should we, like, encourage them to the point of, like, having an overreaction or overcorrection? Not necessarily, but neither does it really help to just, like, ignore them and say, like, what, like, why do you have a problem with, tens of millions of people coming here from all different parts of the world, sort of artificially to not work? And, like, it's not, again, it's not like, I don't have this problem here in PA. I'd imagine Kentucky's probably not the,
No.
number one target for immigrants either. But, like, in the places where they are getting them, like, yeah, suddenly you see, rents go up. You see there's housing problems. You see that there's an increase in crime. And so, and then, of course, like, and I get it. Like, you see stories about, like, abuses and horrible things happening, and then some people want to maybe, like, be really hyperbolic and sensational about them. And then some people want to be like, oh, that, like, rarely happens. And I'm like, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? Like, maybe
Right.
it's not like quite as bad as Fox News is trying to tell me it is, but to also just say, like, it's not happening. I mean, it's like, even liberals in blue cities are freaking out, right? So it's like, it's clearly happening. Otherwise,
Yeah.
Kamala Harris wouldn't have had to, like, do a 180 from being open borders, 5 minutes ago to suddenly being like,
Immigration's a real problem, and we've been working on it real hard for the last 4 years.
Right.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that. And this is where I think that a lot of the conflict has to do with who is going to receive the benefits from the entitlement programs that we have to pay for. And I can understand, like, the resentment, especially if you're a working class American family and a mom and a dad, you both have a job, you're trying to raise your kids, you're trying to pay your mortgage, you're trying to pay for your cars, and you see that there are people that are coming from overseas and receiving all of these government benefits that they have to pay for without receiving any of those benefits themselves, then I completely understand why they would feel resentment towards that. And of course, like, the libertarian solution to the problem is just end the welfare state and let people move where they want. Then we don't have to deal with the issue of people that are paying into a system and not receiving benefits pay for other people that just come in and have never had to pay into that system. And that's where, like, the H-1B visa thing, I think that the solution to that problem is, at least in my mind, so obvious. Like, I think that we should, because I think that it's just been proven through our history that immigration is a good thing on net, and that we should want the best and the brightest people from all over the world to come to the United States and work in our companies. What companies should not receive from the federal government is a tax credit for hiring those people, because even if you hire them in at the exact same cost as you hire an American worker, on net, it's still cheaper for them to do that if they're receiving a tax credit from the federal government. So in the tax credit, let the best and brightest come over here and then compete with the best and brightest of American workers. Like, it just seems to make so much sense that when you take the entitlement mentality out of the equation, then it just solves a lot of the problems. And I think it alleviates a lot of those tensions too, because people don't feel like they're being forced to pay for other people who are not having to pay for the same services that they are, you know?
I think that makes sense. I think that I mean, this is a bit of a pivot, but that's fine. There's this major tension in libertarianism, which kind of like I've been focusing on really since I went to that Rescue the Republic rally back in the end of September. And listen, I think that there are people out there who have good faith disagreements with the Mises Caucus, with Angela McArdle, with Michael Heiss, and all them, and think like, no, we think the Libertarian Party should be run this way and do these things. And okay, that's fine. Like, there are good faith disagreements on the right way to do politics. There's even some people who say don't do politics, don't vote, just agorism, counter economics, counterculture, just the whole way, right? Don't participate in the system at all.
Yeah, our Anabaptist friends.
Right, exactly. So I get that. Like, listen, good faith argument. But I do wonder sometimes if there's a sort of like tension in libertarianism where I think there's some people who, and like, listen, I'll steel man their position because I get it. When you look at sort of like just the problem you brought up, right? That is not like listen, it's really simple in like libertarianism 101 to go like, well, listen, like if you raise interest rates, then that, messes up the signals in terms of what the cost of money is, and people make bad investments because they don't actually know what, they don't have proper market signals telling them like where resources should be properly allocated. Like, hey, that makes sense because it's almost like it's the difference between physics and applied physics, right? Like, it's real easy in physics 101 to kind of be like, oh, like here's the equation for acceleration of gravity and just do that. Then you get to applied physics. You're like, all right, now you got to apply, now you got to factor in wind resistance. Now you got to factor in, and as you're falling, you're going to hit more and more air because different layers of the atmosphere have more or less. So it's like suddenly when you are in the world of applied libertarianism, it's not as easy and safe as libertarianism 101. And I think some people are just like, oh, it's just so bad that we just shouldn't participate because the only solution is to just abolish the state entirely and just have a libertarian paradise tomorrow. And I'm like, okay, sure. Like, find me the Rothbard button and I will literally, like, I would cut my arm off to hit that button. But other than that, like, I don't know, like maybe there will be, like, maybe we can't teleport from here to a free society, just like I can't teleport from where I'm at to your house, right? Like, I'd probably have to spend some time in between there. And I feel like some people, it's like, it's hard work to try to like make those calculations in terms of like, how do we traverse towards more liberty? And so they don't want to deal with it, I think, is kind of like one of the tensions I've noticed over the last few months.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And it is really difficult too, because there are a lot of people, and I call it the libertarian fantasy land, but there are a lot of people that live in the libertarian fantasy land where it's just pure theory all the time. And for me, like I started out my journey really as kind of like a classical liberal in 2016 and then became a public school teacher. And it didn't take me long working in the public schools to become an anarchist because you just realized how corrupt the system is. But it's like, no matter from my point of view, no matter how hard we wish that an institution like the public schools would just disappear, they're not going to. Like, there's nothing that we can do to stop it other than try to educate ourselves, inform people about how these systems work, and then participate enough to maybe get some people in there that will actually minimize the damage that's caused by these institutions. Like, you have to be incremental and you have to be smart. And like, for me, I really do think that like maybe like Cody Cook's an Anabaptist. He makes a lot of very compelling arguments about non-participation. And I've read a lot of Anabaptist thinkers that I think that there are a lot of arguments that are compelling. But if you want to make a change, like you actually have to do something about it, and you have to be able to work within the systems, or you're never going to change them at all. And this is the thing too. It's like, because I get asked sometimes, why as a libertarian would you still work for the public schools? Well, the first answer is that there are like no private schools around here because our government has a monopoly on education, and there's just not a lot of options. On the other hand, and then like, if I leave, who else is going to follow me, right? Like, I feel like it's valuable for me to try to work within the institution to change it, even though it's technically a compromising of my principles at rock bottom. But again, it's just like you said, you have to live in the real world. And with the immigration issue, I just don't think there are a lot of people that are thinking through all of the consequences of all of those beliefs. It's a lot more complicated. And this is another thing too, is that like, people come to these really easy and oversimplified solutions, and they get really angry at people that have a different opinion. It becomes like a very low IQ, very superficial conversation, when there's a lot of nuance that we have to have in there. I think that we need more of that.
Yeah, and I know it's funny. Like, I feel like there needs to be more good faith dialogue, and that's on both sides. Like, I've even, like, I just kind of said a criticism that might be levied more towards one side, but I've even been critical of the other side in this, like and I love Angela, good friend of mine, but I've at times been critical of her, of Heiss, of the Mises Caucus crowd, of like sometimes being equally unwilling to engage in certain conversations, or to kind of like just kind of block and ignore certain critics. And it's like, and listen, I get it. Like, when you have a bunch of people blowing up your comments and stuff like on X, maybe you don't want to deal with it. But I also think that the movement and people would be better served by on both. And again, I think it's both sides. I'm not even saying it's to the same degree. Because sometimes I think, maybe I'm biased, but I think one side tends to be a little bit more angry and unhinged in how they approach things. But still, overall, I think it'd be better to have those conversations. And that's not even just within libertarian circles. There's too many times where I think libertarians are not willing to engage with their critics, right, on the outside world. Like, we want to stay safe in our bubbles. That's why I'm a huge fan of Dave Smith, because like, there is not a challenge he backs away from. If anything, it's now he's gotten to the point where people don't, like, he can't get people to show up and talk with him. Like, I know you really wanted him to have a conversation with James Lindsay, which doesn't look like that's happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's sad.
Which is, I mean, and I'm not even a huge fan of Lindsay, but like, I would have respected him a lot more if he had said, yeah, I'll sit down and talk with Dave. I would have immediately gone from kind of like a default sort of like, frustration and sort of like antagonism towards him, to going, all right, fine. You know what? Like, you're willing to sit down and have a conversation. I might disagree with everything you said, but I respect that you're going to engage in the battle of ideas. And it's really frustrating on all these levels, where people just sort of like retreat to their echo chambers. Like, I get it. Like, I'm not saying you have to do nothing but debate or be a debate me, bro. But I don't know. Like, if you're going to make claims, then be willing to defend them to some degree, especially if you're a really big public figure, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And two, like, I think that it's a very important Christian principle to have, to be actively involved in respectful dialogue with people that don't agree with you. Like, I think it's a spiritual value. It's like a virtue that we as Christians should cultivate. Like, we need to be engaged with the outside world. And when there are divisions within the church, then we should learn to engage with people respectfully. I mean, this is like kind of the real big point that Paul makes at the end of chapter 4 of Ephesians, the beginning of chapter 5, is that like, everything that we do and say should be for the purpose of building somebody up. And so even if we agree with somebody, we should be able to have a debate or an argument with them in a way that at least helps them understand where we're coming from, and then where they also feel like they can freely and safely share their ideas with us. I think it's those kinds of productive dialogues that actually change people's opinions in the long run, rather than just like screaming and yelling at people. But I do think that like, there are so many people whose ability to have a productive conversation with somebody has been destroyed by social media, because in a lot of ways, like, social media privileges like these really angry, really intense, like low IQ back and forth. it doesn't really facilitate the kind of long form conversations that we need to have like productive dialogue on these complex issues. And again, like as a Christian, and that's one of the reasons why like I'm not a very like I don't know, I'm not a very contentious person on social media, because I just don't feel like that's a good reflection of my faith. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I kind of get that. I guess there's different, probably a division of labor there, I guess. Like,
Yeah, for sure.
there's
For sure.
probably, well, I guess there's also a time and place. And I think everyone has to kind of like realize like where they're at, and then sort of like correct for their excess, right? So like there's people who are confrontational by nature, and they probably like they're not having to worry about not standing up for their principles or faith
Yes.
enough. That's more like me. For me, it's never that I'm unwilling to. I have to check myself to go, hey, maybe I don't need to respond to every comment on my social media or in my YouTube videos or something, right?
Right.
I can walk away from stuff. Then there's some people who, maybe have the opposite problem, where like they don't like confrontation, but sometimes our faith might call us to not walk away from a certain confrontation,
Yeah.
because it might be an important opportunity to push back on something that's false, or to sort of like model great. Like we should try to be gracious with pushback. I agree. Like the pushback should be ideally aimed at trying to build up. But I mean, everyone points to I think it's a stereotypical thing. You point to Jesus in the temple with the whips and the flipping of
Right.
tables and
Yes.
stuff, and it's
Yeah.
like, okay, like I get it, maybe they're like, but that wasn't like Jesus did that every other chapter, right? Like
Right.
it's, like, well, so fine, like one time in your life you can pick a time to go make a big giant public scene, and then the rest of the time you should probably try a little bit more to keep the, or like if you cause a ruckus, it's not because of you, right? Like Jesus sometimes would probably just say things, matter of factly, and then people would just try to kill him. But it's not like he was like like,
Right.
threatening them with violence or getting real, especially rowdy or combative with them.
Right. Well, I mean, and you can't avoid the fact that people are going to be offended by what you say. You can just try to be as unoffensive as possible. But I mean, you and I both know, like, no matter how amenable you are, no matter how kind, no matter how cordial, no matter how respectful, there are just going to be people out there that want to attack you no matter what. And I try, like, when I come across those people, I just try my hardest not to engage with them, because, like, for me, I feel like I don't have a lot of time. And I do have, like, especially with what I do in the public schools, there are some times that I have to fight these battles that are a lot more confrontational than I want them to be. And I just don't really have the bandwidth to do that on social media. And so for people that want to like name call or attack or whatever, sometimes it's better just to, I'm glad you get that out of your system. I'm not even going to respond to what you're saying, because it's not worth it to me, and it's not going to help you at all. Like I can tell they don't want to have a conversation, and so it's not worth going after. But it's just like, I mean, everything we've been talking about, life is very complicated, and one of the most challenging aspects of growing up is learning when it is appropriate to respond in certain ways to certain situations. And man, I mean, it's something that, like, I'm sure you feel the same way. I try my hardest. I don't always get that right, but it's a challenge. But people are challenging.
Yeah, I've definitely matured a lot in my approach. I think when I first started engaging on social media, especially after I made my podcast, I have a background in speech and debate. I did speech and debate for 4 years in high school. I was my team captain. We were district champions, went and competed at state, like our state tournament. And like, I was just so used to that, like, oh, people are willing to hash out conversations and ideas. And even if you disagree, or someone thinks something like, I, so I came out of the left, right?
Yeah.
And what chased me out of the left was the wokeism, was the like, hey, if you even question Black Lives Matter, that means that you're a white supremacist. I mean, that's not even being hyperbolic. I was literally a Bernie Sanders voting, card carrying Democrat. I was a vegan. I was in a vegan group, and we were like part of like a vegan activist group. And someone started talking about Black Lives Matter, and I was just like, I don't know, like, I guess I can kind of understand why some people might be put off by just like the sloganeering of it and whatnot. And I think that, police brutality and stuff like that, like it's a little bit more complex than just, police are looking to gun down black men. And then like literally everyone turns to me, it's like, what the, like, like Are you joking? Like, why would you say something like that? Like, you don't realize what internalized, like you have internalized, hatred for black people, and like asking me all sorts of questions about my upbringing and whatnot. And it was just like a jarring, just like the social pressure of it. It's like I've witnessed that firsthand. Then I entered libertarian spaces, and I thought, well, these people won't be like that. They'll be more like what they'll be more like what I enjoyed back in high school, and people were like, in speech and debate, were willing to talk things out. Unfortunately, not always the case. In fact, sometimes, and isn't that a shame? Like it actually really bothers me that some people in our movement are some of the like most angry, most like toxic people that like I've ever seen, and just are. So it's like if like to me libertarianism is this like philosophy of peace, of human
Yeah.
cooperation. Like it's a beautiful philosophy, and if you're going to uh act as a toxic human being and then represent that, I mean that's such a bad witness, right? I mean, same thing when Christians do that, right?
Yeah.
It's just I don't understand why people do that, but I have come to take more of what your approach is, maybe not perfectly, but I try to like listen, you know what, like uh I could spend 30 minutes arguing with this person and I'll probably accomplish nothing other than
Right.
getting really angry and wasting time on this that I could be putting towards things that are more productive and better for me mentally, spiritually, or whatnot. So, uh, yeah, it's such a shame, but unfortunately it happened.
Yeah, and it's really sad with libertarians because we're supposed to be all about the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression. Like these are all things that we say that we value philosophically, but then when it comes to somebody expressing an idea that's even slightly different than the one that we have, then we lose our minds about it. And but again, the same thing happens in Christianity. There's a reason why there are like thousands and thousands of different denominations. Many of them have the exact same core beliefs, but it's like they have a small divergence on the meaning of communion or even when you take communion. And because of that one divergence, they can't go to church together and they can't try to work together. I just think it's like that's so childish and like so petty. And the older I get, I guess, I don't know, the older I get and the more I feel kind of like the weight of the world and all the problems people have, like those things just don't matter to me that much anymore. Like there are people that have real problems. You know what I'm saying? Like
Well,
you're
sometimes I think there's something wrong with me, Alex. Like I always end up in the groups with the most legalistic, argumentative people, even if I agree with the ideology. Now I'm not a vegan anymore, but when I was a vegan, I noticed that I
right.
was like, man, all these vegans are like really angry, and like anyone who's not a vegan, it's like they're the out group, and we have to demonize them and treat them like crap, which I never liked. And then I became reformed, and oh my gosh, like Cage Stage Calvinists and a lot of the people who are online and go around calling themselves reformed are some of the most like self-righteous, cocky, arrogant, like spirited people that you'll
Yeah.
ever meet. Libertarians the same way, and I'm like listen, like you can't actually judge if ideas are right or wrong based on the behavior of people who believe them, because otherwise
Right.
we'd have to
Yes.
throw
Mhm.
Christianity out just
Right.
wholesale. But like man, like I don't even like identifying as reformed sometimes because first of all, I'm not, just like I'm not a real libertarian to a lot of reformed. I'm not real reformed because I don't agree with the traditional reformed view on baptism. Which I know. So you agree with infant baptism, but I
Yeah.
don't agree with infant
Ironically, yes.
baptism.
Yeah.
But but you're more reformed than me, I guess, on that point, which is anyway. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. Lutheran
Um,
background. Yeah. And
yeah,
Catholic
it's
too. Is yeah.
but it's just like, and what's really sad is that there's a major contingency of my audience that's Catholic, and even when I criticize Catholicism, they just like are very nice in the comments, be like, actually, Catholics believe this. Here's a good resource. You could go check that out. Really enjoy your show, man. Keep up the good work. Appreciate it. Whereas, like, I mean, if you, uh, again, not all reformed people, but like. But some of them, they let you know if you like misrepresented something about, it's like, oh, you said the Westminster Confession said this, but actually, and then they bring up the exact citation. It says it this way, and
Right.
it,
Yeah.
it's just it's so it's I don't know. I don't have the right. I guess like it's almost like when systematic theology becomes like legalism. It's just like you can miss me with that.
Yeah, I agree, and I've talked about this a little bit on my show before too, and I don't have time to get in the whole thing today, but I do think that has been one of the trying to think of the best way to put this. This has been one of the greatest shortcomings of Protestantism. And I think that this goes back to the reformers themselves, is that even though they said that salvation is by faith alone, and they made a lot of these kind of grand statements about that, at the end of the day, in the context of the late medieval Catholic Church, it really was for a lot of them all about putting the right ideas together. And so it wasn't about necessarily being saved by grace through faith. It was about being saved by having the right theology. And I think Protestantism has always kind of held on to that idea that, okay, yeah, we say that, you know, salvation by faith alone, but in reality, like, you have to believe all of the right things. And if you don't believe all of the right things, you're not a real Christian. And when people are raised in certain church environments where they just take it for granted that their tradition is correct and all the other traditions are flawed, then it's very easy for them to come to the conclusion that in order to be a real Christian, you have to believe and think just like them. And like, for me, I think this is one of the reasons why I'm pretty laid back about a lot of this stuff, is that I was raised in a pretty ecumenical context. Like, I was born and baptized Catholic. My mom is Methodist. We wound up going to a Lutheran church. I had friends from all over the spectrum, went to a Restoration Movement college. Like, I know people from all over the spectrum, and I've had a lot of great conversations with people from very different backgrounds. And then reading biblical scholarship, like, there are just so many issues in the Bible that just historically we're not able to settle. And it's so complex, and it's so difficult to try to work your way through that. And I realize, like, as I get older, the limitations of my knowledge. Like, I'm just some person from Kentucky. Like, I don't have omnipotent knowledge. You know, there's just a lot of things I don't know. And so I'd rather have conversations with people and try to learn something from them than berate them. And I'm also a lot less secure in my beliefs as an adult than I was like 20. Like, you know, when I first became a Christian, I was 16 or 17. I knew everything there was to know about Christianity. Thank you very much. No one's going to tell me otherwise. And now I'm like, I don't know.
Dude, I was seeing if I could find it. I can't. Like, I literally just saw a post, I think yesterday, from someone who was a reformed account, and he was just like, "Are heretics saved?" And like, I immediately knew what he meant, because like, first of all, like, I think most people would say a real heretic, like, if you think that Jesus Christ was just a man and not divine, or something like that, then like, you would probably like, well, maybe I can't say definitively, but I wouldn't bet on it, right? But I know what he means. Like, you know, he's like, you look at his comments and like, oh, so you mean like anyone who's not reformed?
Yeah.
You know, anyone doesn't believe in your exact rendition of salvation by faith alone. Which, listen, I'm reformed. I get super passionate about. I mean, I think it became a meme in our private chats about how much I talked about covenant theology, that it's just like, you know, everything is just the, you know, it's the, you don't understand covenant theology, and that's why
It's really funny, yeah.
you know, that's why you lost your job, stuff like that, right? Like, I really do like reformed theology, and I do think like it's what I find most persuasive. But that doesn't mean I think that like a Wesleyan, right, like you, or a Catholic even, is not saved. Because I mean, first of all, I don't think even Catholics reject the idea that like we are saved by grace, right? There are different understandings of what Scripture means, right?
Right.
I mean, listen, I think we as Reformed just have to realize that there's a little line in James that says one is not saved by faith alone. That is enough of a wrinkle that we should have a little bit of humility to go, yeah, okay, I don't necessarily think someone's a heretic going to hell, because like, just on that one line alone, it does stand to question if what the Bible is teaching is like, okay, is it entirely faith alone? Is it some combination of faith but plus works? And if it is faith alone, how exactly does faith come about? Is faith a choice? Is faith a gift? Is it both?
Right.
I mean, not even everyone who calls themselves reformed entirely agrees with this, right? So
Yeah. Well, and like, among Reformed biblical scholars, there's a big debate about what the word faith itself means. Like, there's a lot
right,
of space to have conversations about this. And for me, like, I think that probably the most significant passage in the Bible that really affects the way that I think about other Christians and their status before God is Romans 10:9, because it's at the center of the central passage in Paul's most important letter, at least Paul's most important letter for Protestants, the letter to the Romans. So Romans 10:9, Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. So if someone does that, they're saved, and we can work on the details later. And again, like this is the whole thing. I've been doing a lot of work on the Thessalonian epistles lately because I'm doing some solo episodes on that. And Paul makes the point in both First and Second Thessalonians that it's the role, like sanctification is the process by which the Holy Spirit helps us to live into this identity that God gives us through faith. But sanctification is a lifelong process. It's not something that happens once and then you're done. The process of becoming set apart, like God is set apart, is something that we have to constantly undergo by submitting to the Spirit. And so to think that like when you become a Christian, you should have all of the answers and your life should be completely worked out, that's not even biblical. Like that doesn't leave any space for the Holy Spirit to help us grow and develop. And I think that we've really lost a lot of that nuance, you know?
Yeah, one is not saved by sound theology alone.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yes.
No, dude, listen, like I know Romans 9 is sometimes like the stereotypical Calvinist passage, right? Because of the, you know, who are you, a man? But like,
Right.
forget that. I care more. I care less if someone disagrees with me over, you know, reformed soteriology versus maybe something that's more Arminian or something that's in the middle, right? A lot of Christians, Lutherans, Wesleyans, like they kind of don't even fully disagree with, I think, necessarily the reformed conception, but they just maybe have a different emphasis sometimes is what
Yes.
is kind of what my thoughts are and different language to describe it. But besides that, I care less about if we agree perfectly on that. I want every Christian I encounter to read Romans 9 through 11 and just, can we agree that the heart of what Paul is talking about there and in so many of his letters is that this is exactly what the author of Hebrews talks about, right? That this has been the story of the Bible is sort of the continuation of God's redemptive plan to save a people, and that it's always been by faith, and that God has
Yeah.
never been, even when he chose the Hebrews, when he chose the Israelites, even, and you like, this isn't just like New Testament writer revisionist history, right? They didn't go back and like, you can go and just read through the book of Genesis and see in real time God choosing Jacob over Esau, despite Jacob's many shortcomings and whatnot, right? And continually, God is not, he's always subverting the human expectations of who he is going to save, who he is going to work through. And like everything that Jesus teaches is a culmination of this. And so like you get to, you know, Romans 9 through 11, and it's just boiling it down that like, it's not according to the flesh, but by, you know, it's by faith. And I care more about people if we can just agree on that, right? Like I am much more, and I'm not even saying that dispensationalists aren't Christian. I'm just saying, like, to me, that is that's closer to a primary issue for me than, you know, can you affirm the 5 points of tulip?
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And man, I mean, that there's just the biblical witness, I think, is just uniform that God works with broken people, like God works with imperfect people. And I mean, you look at like even the genealogy in Matthew is just Christmas. You look at Matthew chapter 1 and you look at some of the figures in the genealogy. You have Rahab, you have a prostitute, you have Bathsheba. I mean, it's wild that God works through these people that like, for like most American conservative Protestants, if they met somebody who lived like Rahab, would say, nope, there's no way that person could ever be a part of the faith. And yet she makes it into the genealogy in Matthew. It's wild. And then like, it's like one of my favorite examples of this too comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul says at the very beginning of 1 Corinthians that the people that he's writing to, they're holy, they're set apart, they're part of the family of God, they've been saved. But he has to remind them that they can't go and sleep with prostitutes at the temple in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And he's like, well, you know, we believe that this whole sex thing is like the man and the woman are united, and this goes back to creation. So you shouldn't be sleeping with the temple prostitute because that makes you united with her as one person. And like, if you step back and think about what Paul is doing, he's just like, look, you guys are engaging in this horrible behavior. You're still a Christian. Just stop doing it, you know? And that's just like, man, if Paul can make that statement to the Corinthian Christians, then I think that gives someone like me, certainly, because I'm a very flawed person, that gives me a lot of space to say, you know what, nah, God's working with other people too. You know, I shouldn't be so judgmental.
Yeah, I tend to be like, there's a lot of issues that I tend to just sort of punt and be agnostic on when it comes to if someone can do X and be saved, right? Like, I think the big one that our culture, especially like the Christian world, is dealing with right now is homosexuality. Like, listen, I just like I think Paul would there, like you kind of demonstrated. I don't affirm homosexuality. I don't affirm homosexual unions. I'm really not interested in passing judgments about the salvation of people who profess Christ and live a gay lifestyle. Like I'm not going to defend it.
Mhm.
I'm not going to justify it, but I just I don't know. Like I think there's a lot. Listen, David was a man after God's own heart, and look at the things he did, man.
Yeah.
I mean, with Bathsheba and sending her husband off to die. I mean, it's just, and I mean, now he paid a price for that, of course. But like my point just being that like like listen, I wouldn't necessarily like say, oh, that's definitely not an issue, and like you're like I
Right.
like Paul says in Romans 6, 7, I forget if it's 6 or 7, but like, does grace exist that sin should abound? By no means.
Right.
Like we
Yeah.
shouldn't abuse grace, but I'm also not going to sit here and try to like figure out the exact like legalistic limitations of where God's grace ends, right? Like cuz we are all sinners. We're all going through sanctification. We all have different journeys, and I give that person and those people up to the Lord. I pray for them, and I'm like, Lord, you know their heart. I'm trusting like I have my own sin to deal with.
Right.
Like you're still working, your spirit's still working on me for me to deal with my issues. So I'm gonna like, I'll profess what is true, what the Scripture teaches, but I'm not gonna like, uh, I'm not gonna judge people's salvation. I'm not even gonna divide with people. I mean, I have a good friend of mine, James Gentleman, is a practicing gay Catholic, which like, and we've talked about that on my show before and had a good faith dialogue on it. And I was like, and I've even said like, I think it's sinful, but like you're my friend. I think you're a good person. Like I see like you defend the faith and stuff like that. Like so, I don't know. Like I don't even know for like work out. I have to work out my salvation with fear and trembling. I'm not here to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, right?
Right.
But I think there's such a unfortunate like aspect of where Christians want to play legalistic games, and that's not a one denomination problem. That's a like all denominations fall into that trap, which I think is like it's just not like correction like that should be done by individuals in like like to members of their flock or community, privately. Like you don't necessarily need to be uh like it almost gets into a little bit like conservative virtue signaling. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree with you on that. And that is one of the upshots of there being so many different denominations is that there is literally a church for everybody. And if you have a particular way that you want to live your life and you have a particular lifestyle, you can find a church where you will fit in. And I would encourage people to go and do that and then have the conversation and think through these issues and challenge yourself. I just think it's so important to have that. And then like with the whole gay marriage stuff too, I think that we have allowed American culture as American Christians to determine the parameters for our theological conversations. And it's not surprising to me that with the issue of gay marriage being such a hot button issue for the last 20 years or so in American political discourse, that would be so heavily emphasized in theological conversations. However, like if we're looking at that biblically, we live in a country where everyone's pretty much made peace with the fact that divorce is common and that divorce is normal, even convenience divorce. And the Bible has a lot to say about divorce and other issues like that. And so it's just really interesting that like from a sociological standpoint, that we would privilege certain issues over other issues when we really need to just kind of step back and think about how all of this is designed to work together.
Yeah, and listen, it's like it's like I don't want to appear like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth. It's not
Yeah.
even that I'm saying it's not that it's an unimportant issue, but Jesus built relationships with people, and he called out their sin while still having relationships with them, while still serving them. And what I don't like is the response to homosexuals, whether they identify as Christian or not, where like it can be sometimes like I don't like using the word bigot because it's such a like misused word, but there can be a prejudice there. And I like it's not wrong to say, listen, like you like there are some people who uh like listen, I had really strong disagreements with Chase Oliver, right? And we
Yeah.
both talked to him on our show. But like the thing at the bottom of my list that I'm concerned about was that he was gay, But
Right.
I
Yeah.
know that there
Wasn't
were
even,
some
yeah.
people who that was like the top of their priority
Right.
list. And I'm like, dude, I was like, if he was gay but like agreed with me on everything else, I wouldn't care. I would
No.
not. I would go knock doors for him if he was better on like 4 or 5 really important issues. For me, I was much more offended by some of his really bad takes than the fact that he was gay. It was just like that's it's just I don't think people have their priorities in the right place. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Like it just doesn't matter at all. It is funny with Chase Oliver though, because I do kind of like to like I like to play the identity politics games with like my politically left-leaning friends. It's like, well, in 2020, I voted for a woman, and in 2024, I voted for a gay man. So intersectionally,
Right.
my voting record is way better than any Democrat in the United States right now.
That's
So
so
I
funny.
love playing that card. But yeah, but like, and then within the libertarian world too, and this is the thing that I think was one of the best takeaways that I had from going to Freedom Fest this year was meeting the team from Atheists for Liberty. And I had one of their directors, Cherry Teresa, on my show. And what was so incredible about that is that these people have a completely different theological worldview than I do. I mean, they're
Yep.
real honest to God atheists, right? Like they really sincerely believe it. But
Was Sheedy there?
yeah, he was there. And I talked to him for a little bit too. He's a really nice guy. But
Yep.
the thing that we discussed is that when you take the dynamics of power out of the equation, look, I know that they knew that I was not going to try to force them to become a Christian. I knew that they were not going to try to force me to become an atheist. We take the dynamics of power out of the equation. We had really productive conversations, and it turns out that on a lot of really important issues, we're in fundamental agreement. And I think that that is so important, being able to have those conversations. And I think that we need to bring that with us, that kind of mentality with us into the church as we have these really complex debates. And again, I mean, there are a lot of like, because most of what I do right now deals with biblical scholarship. And there are a lot of biblical scholars that I really respect that have made compelling cases for homosexual attraction. I don't agree with them necessarily, but it is interesting that there are people that are much smarter than me out there making those arguments. And I at least want to create a space where I can have a conversation with them about that without cutting it off from the beginning. Because I mean, on all of these issues, I could be wrong. Like I could be wrong about almost everything. And I think
I
it's
mean,
better for me to just be open, you know?
I think Jesus didn't say that he who does not condemn the homosexual couple has,
Right.
not condemned sin and dishonor. Like he said that, he who has not, uh, that which you have not done to the least of these, you have not done unto me, right? Like the emphasis has always been more, I think, about what we do more than what we condemn. And there's just some Christians that seem much more concerned with what we condemn than what we do,
Mhm.
which kind of undermines the whole gospel message. You brought up the whole like Jesus lineage being traced back to Rahab, right? So I brought that up on a show once, and there was this like so Andrew Wilson, who's he hosts the Crucible, and he was reviewing this panel that I was on, and when I brought that up, and he's like Eastern Orthodox, and his audience is mostly like Catholic Eastern Orthodox, and when I brought that, I said Jesus was descended from a sex worker, from a prostitute, and he and his whole audience were like, "Oh, what the heck?" And like they were like freaking out at me, and I was like, "You guys don't know that? Like it's right there
Like it's
in
the
that."
first paragraph in the New Testament.
Right? I was like, and like, but like that crowd is much more concerned. Like they, this is going to be kind of harsh, and I don't mean to generalize, but the general trend I see is that they're cultural Christians, right? Like to them, Christianity is like to them Christianity is like a sports team. It's
Yeah.
like, it's something they can LARP as. It's something they can get like really up in arms about, and like they feel like they're part of something, but like they're not. And again, I'm not even. I won't make judgments of salvation. I can't, but but I will say that if they are saved, they they need to think about how they're walking with God, because I think they have their priorities in the wrong place. Because when I think our focus as a Christians we shouldn't go through life every day waking up motivated by how much we hate sin. That
Right.
is the wrong way to live as a Christian. we should be motivated by, like, we aren't told to go and preach the bad news. Listen, there is bad news, right?
Yeah,
I like that. I
for
like that
sure.
R.C. Sproul quote that, like, actually I have one of his books where he's like, saved from what? So yeah, there is bad news. There can't be, for there to be good news, there kind of has to be bad news. But the bad news is kind of like, I think people most kind of like, even if they don't accept Christianity, they sort of intuitively know that, like, what we live in is not great, right? We live in a fallen world, and people know that, like, it doesn't have to be this way. I think these are things people intuitively know. So, like, we're told to go and proclaim the good news.
Right.
And I just think that there's a lot of Christians that, like, they seem to miss that, which is
Yeah.
really sad.
No, I totally agree, and it's like that passage that Paul quotes from Isaiah at the end of Romans in chapter 15, where he's like, there will be one that rises from the root of Jesse, and in him the nations will hope. Like the whole purpose of proclaiming the gospel is that there's a world out there that desperately needs to hear this message, and it's our responsibility to bring it to them. And if we're not doing that, then we're not doing what God has called us to do. And I agree. I think that message of, like, the fact that God, like, and it's so cheesy because it's quoted everywhere, but there is a power in John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And I think that it's very easy for us, like you said, when we make Christianity like a cultural label or a cultural identity instead of our way of life, it's very easy to lose sight of that. And the fact that this isn't really about us, it's about what we can do for other people.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Alex, I'd love to talk to you for like 2 more hours,
No, that's
but
been great.
I know I have to go eat dinner and put kids to bed, and I know you're a early early riser and early go to bedder, so I
Yes,
don't
I
want to
got
hold
about
you up
another
too much.
hour. Yeah.
Yeah, but tell everyone again where they can find you, plug your stuff before we hop out of here.
Yeah, perfect. So my podcast is called the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. You can find me at libertarianchristians.com. I'm also on every single podcast platform. I just, in the last couple of months, started a YouTube channel. So you can find me at YouTube. That's at Pro Liberty Pod. I've been releasing a lot of my interviews and a lot of shorts over there and some video form stuff. And I got some bonus stuff coming up over there. And then you can find me on Twitter at Pro Liberty Pod.
Awesome. Yeah, everyone, definitely go check out Alex. Go check out our entire crew over at so you go to christiansforliberty.net. And here, I can actually put that up on the screen real quick if you, or did I get, nope, right here.
Oh, there you go.
christiansforliberty.net. You'll go find all of our podcasts. Alex, this has been great. And also, like, this kind of conversation where it's just kind of like low key and we're just kind of talking about whatever comes to mind. I have a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah.
And you guys watching, give us feedback in the comments, because although this Daniel 3 mini series is temporary, I'm going to stop at 100. I want to know if this is the kind of thing that you guys want more of, and if it is, then we'll do more of this in the future in the green room. So make sure you're subscribed to all of that, and that's all we got for you guys. Have a good weekend, everybody. Make sure you go to church on Sunday. Live at peace. Live for Christ. Take care.